am so happy to be here, and I don't want to waste any time, so I'm just going to jump right in. You both grew up in really big families. Ronan, you have 14 siblings, and Tomicah, you have 10. How have those unorthodox upbringings influenced your lives?
Well, it is tremendous preparation for a career in diplomacy, and that virtually everything you do in a large family becomes a complex multi-party negotiation. And so that is very helpful. I think that if you are a strong adherent to the Sinatra doctrine and you want to do everything your way, it can be a little bit challenging. But if your aspiration is to bring peace to the Middle East, it is a great training ground.
You know, if you join me and step into the hot tub time machine back to when I was 9 years old, my average dinner table conversation was, across from me, brother Moses, adopted from Korea with cerebral palsy. He'd be complaining to my sister Quincy, born in an American inner city to a drug-addicted mother. She'd be arguing with my sister Min, who's blind and forgets everyone's race at least once a year. Seriously, she still thinks I'm an Asian woman. So I had the world's problems on my doorstep and a whole lot of different worldviews and perspectives. And all my life, I've admired people who saw problems and built their lives around acting on them. So I saw early on, the next question was always, what are you going to do about it?
There is an old adage, with age comes wisdom. You both started college when you were really young. Ronan, you were 11. Tomicah, you were, a little behind things at 14.
That was slow.
But how has that influenced your work and the trajectory of your careers?
For me, very directly, I was sort of the United States youth envoy working for Clinton. And that came from seeing on the ground the way in which young people didn't have a voice. I was in Afghanistan for a couple of years, in Pakistan, countries with 60-70% of the population under the age of 30, and very little structure for young people to be heard. And I saw all of the ways in which that was a destabilizing influence, but also the ways in which that could be a tremendous power for good if it were harnessed. And my own life was a little bit of a microcosm for that, because I saw how people don't take us seriously a lot of the time. And I saw how painful that can be, and how we all need to work together, old and young, to overcome that for our own sakes, and also for all of our security and prosperity.
And I think in my case, the most important thing that I derived from the experience was perhaps an affectionate disdain for convention. And I realized that there are many advantages to walking a well-traveled path, but from time to time, if you step off that path, good things can happen.
Now, Tomicah, your title, Senior Advisor for Civil Society and Emerging Democracies, is quite the mouthful. What does it mean, and what do you do?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I like to think the State Department, of course, does not have a DARPA, but I like to think that if it did have a DARPA, it would operate a lot like my office. And it grew out of a realization on the part of Secretary Clinton that we are living through a period of extraordinary change. As a result of shifts in technology and advances in culture, it's becoming easier and cheaper than it's ever been before to bring people together around common ideas and unite them in civil society. And that's having a big impact on the diplomatic landscape on which we operate, and it's driving an extraordinary new wave of democratization. And we've seen 40 transitions to democracy even before the advance of the Arab Spring over the last 20 years. And so the result of that is that we need new initiatives and new architecture to help bring the State Department in line with those changes. And the job of my office is to design those new initiatives and that new architecture. It frankly is a lot more like running 4 or 5 parallel Silicon Valley startups than it is like a normal day of diplomacy, but it's tremendous fun and a great way to have an impact on the world.
Now, I love Secretary Clinton, and I'm very jealous that you both had the opportunity to work so closely with her. What is she like? And if the answer is not awesome, please pass.
Well, I was...
It's not a pass.
I was
brimming over wanting to answer. He's going first.
Very fortunate when I came to the State Department initially. I was working as Secretary Clinton's speechwriter, and she asked me to come on board in that capacity. What she did not tell me at the time is that she would be giving 600 speeches a year. And it was a rather extraordinary window into her work ethic, which is unrivaled, I think, certainly in Washington, D.C. She is the hardest working woman in politics, and we all know that women work harder than men. And so it was a great opportunity to see her up close. If you want to catch up on your sleep, she's not a fantastic boss, if you want to change the world, you could not ask for a better person to work for. And she also couples that commitment with a deep appreciation for individuals. I'll never forget once when we were traveling together in Africa, one of the reporters who was with us on the plane ate something that he shouldn't have eaten and got extremely sick as a result. And of course, the Secretary of State showed up outside his hotel room door with a bowl of soup to try and nurse him back to health. And that's just the kind of person that she is.
Well, let me be the first to say she's terrible. She is the most extraordinary leader and the most extraordinary boss on a personal level, and I think particularly for people like Tomicah and myself who were tasked with doing something rather entrepreneurial, starting up a new office in a slow-moving bureaucracy. The fact that she sees that, supports it, and does so without ever a hint of condescension, with the full belief in the strength of good ideas, regardless of where they come from, is something that I was very inspired by personally. She also, in the interest of supporting innovative things, gets really excited about young people and young ideas and new technologies. And to witness her use an iPad is an amazing thing. It's like this. I keep trying to explain, like, the touch works only in this area. She's amazing.
And Ronan, you've worked a lot with youth issues. There are some countries like India who are at the beginning of a youth bulge, and there are other countries like China who are experiencing the end of that phenomenon. How do you think this is going to influence the geopolitical landscape over the next few years?
Well, look, Mia, you can spin the numbers a lot of different ways, but there is a lot of evidence that there's a correlation between elevated bulges of young people in the country's demographics and instability, unrest. We've seen how that can inspire tremendous hope with, for instance, the Arab Spring revolutions. And we've also seen how that can quickly be derailed and lead to a forfeiture of democratic ideals when those revolutions go awry. By the same token, in countries like China, as you mentioned, in the coming decades, we're going to see an unprecedented number of aging individuals that are then dependent on a dwindling working age population of young people. And that too poses tremendous problems from an economic standpoint, just to begin with. In both cases, I think the moral of the story is it's really incumbent on us, people of our generation, to build solutions. And there's going to be a lot of weight on our shoulders to carry the rest of the population.
And Tomicah, how has that influenced your work with civil society?
Well, I think we've been very fortunate to be conducting diplomacy at a time when the balance of power between citizens and governments is shifting very profoundly. And what we have witnessed over the last 2 decades is a tenfold increase, even by the most conservative estimates, in the number of international civil society organizations. And as those groups take on a bigger role in the realm of international policy, it's incumbent on all of us to find new ways to work with them. And so we see young people, we see technology driving this change. And it's a great opportunity for governments around the world to revise their business models and do things a little bit differently.
And Tomicah, you've done some work establishing what I think is called the LEND network. Can you explain what that is?
It stands for Leaders Engaged in New Democracies, and it grew out of a conversation that I had with Secretary Clinton about 1.5 years ago, 6 months following the beginning of the Arab Spring. And we were sitting at a dinner table and recognized that many of the leaders in these countries who were being put in positions of extraordinary responsibility had no training and no perspective to carry out the tasks before them. They were being plucked out of jails where they had been political prisoners, they were being pulled from academia, and they'd never run a large ministry or been in charge of a government. But there were fortunately a lot of other people who had that experience, who had been through transitions before. And so we got together with about 20 governments that had come through successful transitions and asked them to find the individuals within their societies who'd been responsible for the most successful aspects of those transitions. And then we sat down with technology partners like Google and OpenText and Spontanea and built out a new online platform that allows for real-time voice, video, and text communication with real-time translation. And we connected that extraordinary pool of talent, people like the former head of the Chilean army who led the transition to civilian rule, or the former foreign minister of Slovakia, or the former president of Mongolia, the Supreme Court Justice of South Africa, with key leaders in countries like Tunisia and Moldova, and gave them for the first time something that looks like a tech support line for setting up a new democracy. And it's one example of how we are trying to reach out and change the way we engage the world.
How is the democratization of information going to influence both of your work in the future? When all of India has access to the same courses that I do as a Yale student, what is that going to do for the world?
I'm glad that you mentioned education in particular. I come from this sort of diplomacy, foreign policy background. People always expect me to sort of bang on about the world's problems outside of our borders. I really think one of the great problems facing America and the world is the current state of our domestic education system. You need to look no further than the latest State of the Union to see that our leaders share that sentiment. A lot of headway needs to be made, and one of the things ratcheting up the pressure is the fact that there is the amount of transparency and sharing of information that there is now. We know that there are successful models elsewhere. You mentioned India. We can look to Shanghai. There are a lot of places where we've seen education much more robust than what we're doing right now. And if America wants to stay competitive and prosperous, and I want my children to have the opportunities that I had, we need to see some of those models we look at elsewhere replicated right here.
And I think that in our case, we are recognizing that there are entirely new ways to help people build their democracy. One of the projects that I'm involved in right now is launching a massive open online course, which is known by the unfortunate acronym of a MOOC, on comparative democratic development. And that's going to be available to people all over the world, and it doesn't matter whether you are a city councilman in Ulaanbaatar or you are a head of state in a small country in Africa. You're going to have access to the best thinking from the best minds around the world on how you set up a new democracy. And those opportunities are something that we've never been able to make available to people before. And my hope and expectation is that they are going to turn the task of setting up a new democracy from what had previously been an individual task for each individual country to a collective undertaking and a collective responsibility for an entire community of democracies. And we'll see innovation and we'll see progress occur much more quickly as a result.
So one advantage of traditional diplomacy is that you know exactly who to talk to in other governments. How do you identify these untraditional and non-state actors with whom you're engaging?
One of the things that we found is that those outside of civil society, and we throw around the term a lot, and I will take just a moment to unpack it. We think that our nations are frequently supported by three legs of a stool. You have government, where political activity takes place. You have the private sector, where we work for financial gain. And then you've got civil society. And in civil society, we come together in civic organizations, as activists, in religious congregations, as journalists, and we work through peaceful means to make our societies better. And one of the big challenges we face in diplomacy is that we often have what I call this STP problem, which is that the same 10 people in civil society get invited to participate in every opportunity. And what we've tried to do more recently is listen to voices in civil society and ask them who we should be talking with, and actually have them drive the process of engagement and tell us who are the most innovative and effective actors in their space. And we're seeing great results.
And my work during my years in government was very much a response to the same dilemma, having seen the fact that young people were disenfranchised in their own communities, but also somewhat disenfranchised in the traditional diplomatic process. The question was, what can we do to not only speak to them to avert the instability that often ensues when young people don't have a voice in a productive way, but also to harness the good ideas that are coming from young people. So my process was, in 50 countries around the world, the office that I set up, the Office of Global Youth Issues, still there at the State Department and doing really good work, set up councils of local young people that traditionally wouldn't have any dealings with us, and outsourced a lot of the policy decisions and also a lot of the program design, where we were giving them seed money and saying, look, if you have the best idea, go out and do it, make it happen. Mostly focused on building jobs for young people, which is an acute need, obviously, that we feel everywhere around the world.
And how do you ensure that the seriously disenfranchised are actually being involved in these processes? I mean, I was on a youth commission growing up, and it was not representative of the place where I grew up. It was a very specific set of people who were put on that. How are you finding these individuals who aren't usually heard from?
One of the toughest things to do as a diplomat is to get outside of a capital city. And it requires a lot of planning, it requires a lot of logistics, but it is absolutely essential if we want to connect with people. And so one of the things that I try to do, I'm fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, in that I spend a lot of time at our embassies around the world. And I always ensure, if I can, that I spend some time out in the countryside, in smaller towns, meeting with civil society leaders or young people at universities that are far away from the centers of civic and economic life. And you get a very different perspective as a result of that, and it's the type of diplomacy that we need a lot more of in our country.
And I think Secretary Clinton really played an instrumental role in shifting the balance so that what used to be considered so-called soft diplomacy, talking to women's groups, youth groups, civil society groups, actually became a core pillar of our focus. She is a rare phenomenon indeed, someone that focuses on that, and will be missed. I trust Secretary Kerry, given his legacy, doing exactly that, will continue. But it must be said, the reality is it's not only one of the toughest things to include the disenfranchised in our processes, it's a problem we haven't really cracked, even with all of that focused effort from a great leader like Secretary Clinton. I don't believe the United States government, everywhere that it does business, does a fraction of what it needs to get people at the table that we just don't usually hear from.
If I can add one more point on that, right around the corner from my office at the State Department is a beautiful suite of rooms called the Treaty Rooms, and it's where we sign our most important agreements and where the Secretary of State does photo opportunities with visiting dignitaries. And when we get a new Secretary of State in the United States, every single foreign minister around the world wants to be the first person to take a picture with our new Secretary of State in those treaty rooms. And Secretary Kerry did something really extraordinary. For his first photo opportunity in the treaty rooms, he hosted 4 visiting women civil society leaders from Burma. And I think it sends a very powerful signal about the type of diplomacy that we are going to be engaging in over the next 4 years.
And just to wrap things up, what advice do you have for students?
Well, I would say recognize that change in the 21st century is going to occur at the intersection of government, the private sector, and civil society. Stake out some space for yourself at that intersection. And once you have staked out that space, get involved in civil society. And it doesn't so matter, I think in that situation, get involved in a civic organization, start a civic organization, put on a TED conference. The form of your engagement is less important. Because what we know from now a generation of social science is that when people get involved in civil society, it doesn't just help us make progress on individual issues, but it helps replenish the reservoir of trust that irrigates everything else we do in our nations. And so I think that by working to solve for your individual why through civil society, regardless of what that why is, you're not only going to make progress on that important singular agenda item, but you're going to help address every challenge that we face as a species and as a planet.
For a long time, the traditional wisdom about the young brain was it's like a deficient version of what we ultimately get as adults. But the more recent vogue in the evolutionary biology thinking on this is actually it's a selectively advantageous trait, that the fact that our species goes through a period of time that most of the people in this audience and most of us on this stage are relatively in, that, for one thing,
Thanks,
carries
Ronan.
with it some... it carries with it a lot of understandable downsides. We go through a period of recklessness, of sort of a self-centered conviction that the rules don't apply to us, and a willingness to break the rules that we do see, all of which can make us insufferable, but also all of which presents some of our greatest hopes for breaking through old enmities and obstacles that we see all around the world. And I've been most inspired to see young people embrace that recklessness, harness it, and build solutions using it. So my message to students would be, you're in a period of your life where you have things that are maybe not as liabilities, but assets in that fight. So go to it now. Don't wait. Be impatient.
Thank you so much. And